Alright, so in this second video covering scatterplots and also the introduction to correlation and regression, we're going to take a look at this example and plug it into your calculator. Be sure to have a graphing calculator, either the Texas Instruments or a similar phone app, to get this data onto your screen. There are going to be several shortcuts that are going to be very specific to certain devices, so be aware that you should be versed in knowing how to do everything manually, even if your calculator allows for shortcuts. And I'll tell you about that when we get there. So let's take a look at the following data and make a graph on the calc. We're going to make a plan to fill out the window settings before trying to plot the data. Now, is there a correlation between a rental company's quantity of cars, measured in tens of thousands, and their revenue in billions? So what we have here is we have two lists of data. We have 6 car companies, and we've labeled the car companies A through F. And we have the number of cars in tens of thousands. So for example, that's car company A has 63 tens of thousands. So that's 630,000 cars. And company F has 8.5 tens of thousands of cars. So that's 85,000 cars, or 8.5 ten thousands. Now the revenue is a little easier to read because it's in billions, So and revenue, by the way, is not profit. Revenue is how much money you take in. Once you actually pay back the upkeep of the cars and the payment of the employees and all the other auxiliary payments, such as gasoline and other stuff you've got to do for the cars, that's called profit. But revenue is just money coming in. So it looks like we've got a lot of revenue for a lot of cars and a little bit of revenue for a little bit of cars. So we have to think about what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable. It's always important. Now, 99% of the time, the independent variable, the one we can change, is given in the first list. And that makes sense in this situation as well, because you can purchase cars. You can just go and buy some cars and make those cars part of your rental car empire. Now, the revenue is the independent variable, and that is the Y, and that makes sense because we can't just go and have revenue. Like, oh, okay, I'm just going to change my revenue. No, we can't just change how much money you make. The cars influence the revenues, so the revenue depends on the cars. So the independent variable is the cars. Now, it is important to kind of keep remembering that the independent variable is the cars in 10,000s, okay? That's important because we have to kind of keep our scale in mind. We're not buying 63 cars and making $7. This is a much bigger problem in scale. And the dependent variable is the revenue in billions of dollars. Okay. So, what we want to do is we want to look at that table and kind of plan our window. Now, this is the window key on the calculator, and in fact, you can go to your graphing calculator and click, well, turn your calc on first of all, and then click window, and you can see that the default window is -10 to 10 by 1, and -10 to 10 by 1. Now, there are other values after this, and you might see X resolution and delta scales and stuff like that with little triangles. We are not going to be concerned with anything other than the first 6 numbers here. Okay, these are what we need to look at. So the X minimum really has to deal with, I'm looking at my X values. What would be my smallest X value? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that, and I'm going to the safe bet is 0. And it's because you're thinking like, well, my lowest value is 8.5. Well, we want to go below 8.5. And in fact, we want to think of the minimum and the maximum roughly at the same time, because if we have to go between 8.5 and 63, a better bet would go between 0 and 70. But we're not going to go by ones anymore. We're going to go by tens. That way we have 7 easy tick marks on our calculator to look at, or if we're to graph this, look at the bottom of the worksheet, you can see that we are going to have 7 easy tick marks. Now my Y minimum and Y maximum, again, let's look at our Y values at the same time, min and max. Looks like my smallest is 1.4 and my largest is 7, so I think going from 0 to 7 would be appropriate. Some books like to say you always go above your maximum, but we can land right on that and still see it on the corner of our calculator. And the scale of 1 is appropriate. The scale of 1 is very appropriate because if we're going to count from 0 to 7, we're going to count by ones. So in this blank space right here, again, to get to this, you may want to put a box around that because that's the key you push to see this. And then this summarizes what you did. We're going to start our x at 0, go by tens to 70. Now, what I want to do is introduce the interval notation. So by using brackets, this shows us that our domain, or our x values, are going to go between 0 and 70. So we can do the same thing for the y. If you want to pause the video and see if you can write your y statement and y's range, range would be given with an R and a colon instead of a D. This is how we figure out the difference between the x domain and the y range. Go ahead and do so. Just pause it, write the sentence, and then unpause to check your answer. Okay, we're going to start our y at 0, go by ones to 7. And our range will be 0 to 7. And these are brackets because we actually can get to 0 and can get to 7. They would be parentheses if we couldn't. So let's say if we wanted to go between 0 and 70, which means 1 to 69, we would use parentheses instead of brackets. So the brackets are the correct math grammar for those intervals. So let's kind of work on our screens. Okay, now what I need to do is I need to fix these before we go any further. So if you get to your graphing calculator, click on the y equals key. You'll notice that this screen on your worksheet and the screen that you have don't look exactly the same. You see how this plot 1 is highlighted? So I just need to move my cursors using the cursor key here, and if I move up to the plot 1 and hit enter, boop, you can see that now it is highlighted. So you have to make sure that this is dark or on or highlighted. Okay, make sure that that plot 1 is on. It's dark, it's on, it's highlighted. Black is great, make sure it's black. This is awesome. Okay, now, if you do that correctly, then you're going to see the dots. Now, I do want to highlight one last thing, is you see where this cursor is, and my cursor is? Notice right now there's nothing here. Make sure there's nothing here because you're going to see that on the screen and it's going to interfere with the dots that you're trying to look at. Now we are going to put something there later in units 3 or sections 3 and 4. So at this moment we want it cleared out. So if you did everything right, because this screen right here, and I should have mentioned earlier, this screen could have been accessed if you hit the y equals key. Some bad teaching here. How did you get to that screen, Mr. Anderson? By clicking the y equals key. So if you go to your calculator, click the y equals, gets you to this screen. Sorry to make that a little confusing if you didn't know where I was going before. So now let's get to the stat plots. Now you'll notice that right above the y equals key is the stat plot in the same color as your second button. So if I click the second button and I click the y equals button, now it takes me to stat plots. Now if you're going to get the problem right, you're going to see a couple things after you go second y equals. Okay, second y equals. If you get the problem right with the second y equals, you notice that this is on. This is good because this on represents this turning this dark or on or highlighted or black. This is all good, right? You have these on. Also, this picture should look like a scatter plot. Okay, now the only reason why it wouldn't look like a scatter plot is if someone messed with your calculator. Okay, now you'll notice that these are off. We don't need these on. We're only going to look at one series of scatter plots at a time. But I want to show you that on the calculator, sometimes, like especially when my young kids grab the calculator and start playing around, they may get to this screen and they may hit enter and they may change the look, like they may go to a line graph or a histogram or a box and whisker plot with and without outliers. All right, so you have to make sure that it looks like a scatter plot. So if you get to this screen, let's say someone gets to this screen and goes like, whoa, that does not look like a scatter plot, just hit enter and move your arrow key down and turn it into the scatter plot. Now we are going to choose list 1 and list 2, and you can choose the pixel that you want to represent your dots. That's just cosmetic. It's not like, you know, one's better than the other technically. Although I do find the pixel dot is a little bit hard to read, especially if it's landing on or near the line of best fit. So I choose one of the two options for best visibility. So when you're done here and you're like, how do I get out of here? Click the second key and the mode key. The second key and the mode key will get you to a clear screen. And now we get to graph it. And I'd like to graph these dots by hand first, because if all else fails, you're going to have to do so by hand. And more importantly, you're going to have a paper pencil assignment. And that paper pencil assignment is going to have you graph things by hand, because you're not going to try to screen cap or send these to me through any kind of digital service like, oh, I want to just print this off. Nope, do it by hand. So we're going to start off with 0 in the corner, and our X's, as written above, are going to go by tens, okay? And they're going to go to 70. I've given you just enough tick marks to get there. Now, my Y values are going to start at 0, and sometimes they don't actually start at 0. Sometimes the X and Y values start at different numbers, and then you just put a little number off to the side here to show that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we're going to graph our first point for Company A, which was 63 tens of thousands of cars and $7 billion in revenue. So just like in a reverse game of Battleship, I'm creating a dot at 63,7. Now the second company, Company B, was 29 tens of thousands of cars, or 290,000 cars, and what we have is $3.9 billion of revenue. Now, as I say these units, it's in my best interest to also label these. So this would be cars, 10K. That's a nice way of saying 10,000. And then this would be revenue, billions. Okay, so on to the third point, 20.8, which is a little higher than 20, and 2.1. So put a dot there. All right, D is 19.1, which is a little bit lower than 20, and 2.8. So there we go. And then E is 13.4 and 1.4, so right around here. And then finally, F is 8.5, which is less than 10, and 1.5, which is a little higher than 1.4. So there are my points. Now, if you had to kind of like look at an imaginary line from the lower left to the upper right, this seems like a positive correlation. If I had to draw a line, it would intersect a few of them, but I'd say this is a pretty strong positive line because they kind of follow a trend, an upward trend. And you might want to say, well, I think that's an outlier. Is it? Is it really an outlier? We're actually going to discuss outliers in the last section of this unit and what would constitute an outlier. But don't call it an outlier. The reason why you don't want to call it an outlier is because it could be a perfect point, just, you know, further away than the others if you followed it with your eyes. But now let's get this on the calculator. Now, here's my hope. My hope is that we did everything right. We got our Y equals, so our black section is exactly the way I want it to be. Second Y equals, yep, looks like I'm going to make a scatter plot, but I need to fix my window. So click the window key and enter 0, enter. Then click 70, enter. And then we're going to go by tens. Our Y minimum is going to be 0, enter, and our Y maximum is going to be 7, enter, and keep the Y scale at 1, or change it to 1 if it's not at 1. Now, you might be thinking, well, why am I doing all this if I'm going to do it by hand? Well, in the next section, we're going to be putting in a line of best fit, and we're going to want to see how that goes. Now, if you did everything right, you should be able to hit graph, and you can see that I do not have my dots on the screen, which is a little surprising here, and the reason why is because I didn't type them into the calculator in the first place. So make sure that your dots are typed in the calculator to get them on the screen. Now I'm going to clear out my list 2 and clear out my list 1. Couldn't get the dots if you didn't type them in. So now in list 1 I'm going to type in my 63 and my other numbers and so forth. And we're going to list all the steps I went over at the end of this video, so you'll have a nice checklist as you go through the problem. Okay. So here is the last value of my list 1, or my last x value. Okay, here's 7, 3.9. Keep missing the decimal there. There we go. 2.1, 2.8. Oh, and if you make a mistake like I just did, you just go over strike, 1.4, and 1.5. Now that I've entered my data, I should be able to hit graph and see those 5 beautiful points. You can see this last one got cut off a little bit, but it's really neat to compare the actual graph here to this graph here. All right, so what this allows me to do now is it allows me to make some final notes, and I would love to go through all the calculator steps it took for me to get here. So, step 1, what do I do first? Well, what I didn't do first is what I should have done first is step 1, enter x into L1, y into L2. Now you are a data entry master, because if you've been through all of the chi-squared goodness of fit testing, independence testing, and testing for homogeneity, you are amazing at typing in this stuff here, and matrices as well. So, in case you did forget, this would be stat enter. Okay, stat enter to enter the stats. Microsoft is giving me a little fits here because I put a lot of tick marks on the screen here. Okay, so once you enter this into list 1, list 2, you want to check your y equals. Okay, check your y equals, and you want to check your y equals just to make sure it's right. And then number 3, check the stat plot. And once you've checked this once, you don't need to recheck it, but to get to the stat plot, you'd hit second y equals. All right, and then number 3 twice. Number 4 is you're going to fix your window. Now, here's where I'm going to give you a huge shortcut for my Texas Instruments users. A good way to check or fix the window, if you're just trying to see the screen, is to click Zoom and then to click the 9 key. Now, if I scroll down and show you what the Zoom 9 is, it's Zoom Stat. And what Zoom Stat does, it zooms in on the data and gives you a little cushion room around each of the points, so the points are not kind of crammed in. Now I can show you that the window got real weird. Look at all the decimals there, all right? They're trying to zoom in on the stat and make sure it looks pretty nice. I would use Zoom 9 when I didn't have to graph it by hand. If you have to graph anything by hand, don't use Zoom 9. But if you do have to graph things, if you don't have to graph things by hand, you're free to use this just to check your work here. A word of note: most graphing calculator applications on the phone do not have this zoom command, or at least in the way that I presented it. You may have to hunt and find that zoom command, but lucky for you, you're just going to have to enter the window by hand, and that's going to be, make you a better math student anyway. Zoom 9 is pretty lazy, but Zoom 9 gets the job done in a jiffy when you need to do quick analysis and actually not any paper pencil work. And then step 5, of course, is to hit the graph key. And to get out of any of these screens, as a reminder, hit second mode, and hitting the second mode key will get you back to where you started. So there we go. There's a lot of tech. I'm teaching you how to type the dots in on the calculator. If you're doing this class online or virtually, doing the work in the calculator isn't as important as doing it on paper. So if you get frustrated and feel like, wow, I can do this on paper, but I just have so much technical difficulties with the calculator, don't worry. You're mostly going to have to put things in on paper anyway, especially for tests and final exams, and paper pencil homework assignments. So thank you very much for kind of leveling up your game of Scatterplots from maybe years of old, and I appreciate you working with me on this, and stay tuned for the next big section about the regression equation.